I think he thought that, kind of Zelensky wasn't very popular. There was an awful lot of, pro-Russian sentiment in whatever way he thinks that is, because people have Russian speakers, and that, they're kind of, in polling, they expressed affinity with Russia. I mean, certainly in Crimea, that worked out because a majority of the population had, higher sentiments or feelings of affinity with Russia. And, obviously, that kind of, they got traction there. But it's more complicated. We talked about Donbass before, about being a kind of melting pot when, they tried the same thing in Donbass, Donetsk and Luhansk, because they tried in Crimea in 2014, didn't kind of pan out. In fact, a whole war broke out. They tried, to kind of in, many of the major cities that are now under attack, including Odessa, to kind of foment, pro-Russian movements, and they completely and utterly fell apart. So Putin was thinking, I'm pretty sure based on polling and the FSB having infiltrated, an awful lot of the Ukrainian hierarchies, we're now seeing is quite apparent with some of the dismissals in Ukraine. He was pretty sure that, kind of he would get traction, and that it would be like 1956 in Hungary or 1968 in Czechoslovakia. Remember, he comes out of the Andropov levy, as it's called, a kind of cohort of people who come into the KGB under Yuri Andropov. And Yuri Andropov has presided over a lot of these anti-dissident, kind of movements inside of Russia itself, and how you suppress opposition, but also over, how you deal with, kind of the uprisings in, Czechoslovakia and Hungary. And there's all these lessons from this that, you can put everything back in the box. And yeah, there might be a bit of violence and a bit of fighting, but ultimately you think you've got the political figures and you decapitate the opposition. So they thought Zelensky would run away. Yanukovych ran away, but, that was kind of a bit, sort of a different set of circumstances. And they thought that all of the local governments would, kind of capitulate because they had enough Russians, in inverted commas, in there. Again, mistaking language and, kind of positive affinity towards Russia for identity or how people would react in the time, and not understanding people's, linkages and, kind of importance of place, the way that people feel about who they are in a certain set of circumstances and a place.
But the invasion of Ukraine in 2022 is unlike anything that he was ever involved with. So I
don't think he thought it would be. Because it's kind of, if he looks back into the past, you're right, though, he wasn't involved in 68 or 56 or what happened in the 1980s in Poland.
But there's a very wide front, and it's the capital. And this isn't going from...
This isn't Chechnya, this isn't, kind of Syria, or, for example.
This is a major nation.
Exactly.
Like it's large to the size.
It was more like Afghanistan, but they didn't realize that because, again, Ukrainians are us. There's this kind of inability to think that people might think differently and might want something different, and that 30 years of independence actually has an impact on people and their psyches. And if I look back to the 1990s, I remember being in seminars at Harvard at the time, and we were doing a lot of research on, what was happening in, the former Soviet Union at the time, because the early 1990s, just after the whole place fell apart. And there was already under Yeltsin this kind of idea of Russians abroad, Russians in the near abroad, Russian speakers, and the need to bring them back in. Mm-hmm. And I remember, we had seminars at the time where we talked about at some point there'd be some people in Russia that would actually believe that those Russian speakers needed to be brought back into Russia, but that the people who spoke Russian might have moved on because they suddenly had other opportunities and other windows on the world. Look what's happened in Scotland, for example. Most people in Scotland speak English. The Scottish language is not the standard bearer of Scottish identity. It's almost a civic identity, a different identity than not just national identity, just like you see in Ukraine. And there's lots of English people that have moved to Scotland and now think of themselves as Scottish, or Brazilians or Italians, and all kinds of people who've moved in there. It's a smaller population, obviously, it's not the scale of Ukraine, but people feel differently. And there's been a devolution of power. And when Brexit happened, Scotland didn't want to go along with that at all, and they wanted to kind of still be, having a window on Europe. And that's kind of historic. And lots of people in Ukraine have looked west, not east. It depends on where you are, not just in Lviv, or somewhere like that, but also in Kiev. And Kharkiv, was kind of predominantly a Russian-speaking city. But Kharkiv was also the center of Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian literature, at different points. People have different views. I grew up in the north of England. We don't feel like the south of England. There's been a massive divide between north and south in England for millennia, not just centuries. So, people feel differently depending on where they live and, kind of where they grew up. And Putin just didn't see that.
So
He didn't see that.
Well, hold on a second. Let me sort of push back at the fact that I don't think any of this is obvious. So first of all, Zelensky before the war was unpopular.
Oh, he was. What was it? 38%, something like that. But best in the popularity. Yeah.
Let me sort of make the case that the calculation here is very difficult. If you were to poll every citizen of Ukraine and ask them, what do you think happens if Russia invades? Just like actually put each individual Ukrainian in a one-on-one meeting with Putin and say, what do you think happens? I honestly think most of them will say they will agree with a prediction that the government would flee, it would collapse, and the country won't unite around a cause because of the factions, because of all the different parties involved, because of the unpopularity.
You might have said the same thing about the Soviet Union when Hitler invaded in 1941. You see, the problem is Putin always reads history from one perspective over another. I think most countries basically rise to their own defense. So this is actually one of the first times that Russia has been on the offensive rather than on the defensive. So there's kind of a bit of a flip there. Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously Afghanistan, but that was more complicated because it was also supposed to be an intervention, right? I mean, it wasn't supposed to be to annex Afghanistan. It was to try to prop up, kind of or reinstall a leader there. Syria, you were in there to help your guy Bashar al-Assad turn away the opposition. Chechnya was a debacle. The Chechens fought back big time, and it was only by dint of horrible, violent persistence and ruthlessness and nasty, dirty tricks that, kind of Putin prevailed there. And then, you wonder, did he prevail? Because what happened? Chechnya sometimes describes the most independent part of the Russian Federation, and Ramzan Kadyrov, plays power games in Moscow. Yeah, his predecessors, even his father and others wouldn't have done that. Ahmed Kadyrov and, before that, Dadayev and Maskadov. I mean, they were willing to make a compromise, but, they wouldn't have had, the same position that Kadyrov has had. So, I think that, again, it's your perspective and where you stand and which bit of history you start to read. And that's why I say that, I think Putin, it's the information, the way that he processes it. I think most Russians also can't believe that they've done something wrong in Ukraine. I mean, maybe at this point things are changing a bit, but that's why there was, so much kind of support for this, right where, I mean, I have Russian friends again who said, but look what, was happening in Donetsk. Look what was, the Ukrainians were doing to our guys. Look what was happening to Russian speakers. We were defenders. We were not, we're not invaders. I think, again, the special military operation, idea now, I think it's flipping, obviously, in the way that with the war going on there. But Putin wasn't, kind of looking at what would happen. I mean, most of the kind of glory parts of Russian history, when you kind of go in, you chase Napoleon back to Paris, or you chase the Germans back to Berlin, you put the flag above the Reichstag. Mm-hmm. That's a very different set of affairs. When you've been fighting a defensive war, you've been invaded from a war where you invade someone else. And even the most fractured populations, like you had in the Soviet Union, at the point rally round, and World War I that fell apart. I mean, the Tsar didn't manage to rally everybody around. Mm-hmm. I mean, the whole thing fell apart. And World War II, Stalin had to, revive nationalism, including in the republics in Central Asia and elsewhere, to revive nationalism. And Ukraine suddenly found nationalism, in a kind of sense of.
That's really interesting, because it's not obvious, especially what Ukrainians went through in the 1930s. It's not obvious that. I mean, my grandfather was Ukrainian, and he was proud to fight. A Ukrainian Jew, he was proud to fight and willing to die for his country. It wasn't like
his country then was the Soviet Union.
The Soviet Union, right? Sorry, to clarify.
But he might fight now for his country, Ukraine.
Yes, but I'm just like lingering on the point you made. It was not obvious that united feeling would be there.
No, and again, it wouldn't have been obvious with the Soviet Union.
That's sorry.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Sorry, I was referring to my grandfather with the Soviet Union. We're both saying the exact same thing.
Yeah, we are. We're
you're
saying the same thing.
It's a really powerful thing because I take it because you take history as it happened. You don't realize it could have happened differently. It's fascinating.
It's that whole counterfactual, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I mean, if you kind of that's why we all need in the United States to really examine our own history. Because, there's a lot of lessons from that we should treat very cautiously. It doesn't mean that, history repeats or even rhymes, it's the old axiom all the time. But there are a lot of things that you can take away differently from putting a different perspective and a different slant on the same set of events. I mean, I always used to wonder, how many books can be written on the French Revolution or even on the Russian Revolution? Yeah. I studied with Richard Pipes. I remember he was really offended after he'd written his great magnus opus on the Russian Revolution, 2 volumes, that other people would, kind of write about the Russian Revolution. He said, I've written it all. And I thought, well, actually, maybe you haven't. It's like there might be some completely different angle there that you haven't really thought of. And that's Putin. I remember Peskov saying, Putin reads history all the time, Russian history. And I thought, well, maybe he should read some world history. Maybe he should, kind of read some European authors on Russian history, not just, reading Lomonosov for, Russian historians on Russian history, because you might see something from a very different perspective. And look, and the United States made a massive mistake in Vietnam, right? I mean, they saw Vietnam as kind of weak, manipulated by, kind of external forces, China, Soviet Union. But the Vietnamese fought for their own country. They suddenly became Vietnamese. And Ho Chi Minh became, kind of basically a kind of a wartime fighter and leader, in a way that, perhaps people wouldn't have understood either.